License and registration. You're parked in a restricted zone.
Officer, I'd like the ordinance number. And your badge number, please.
He didn't answer. He uncapped his pen and started writing a citation for a law that didn't exist. That was the biggest mistake he would ever make in his life. He just didn't know it yet. 30 people stood watching. Nobody said a word. The Sunday sun was warm and gold. The smell of ripe peaches drifted down from the farmer's market half a block away, and a 54-year-old woman stood handcuffed against her own car, back straight, hands visible, eyes steady, calm in the way that only comes from years of standing in front of things far worse than this. She didn't beg. She didn't scramble for excuses. She didn't look down once. And the question that hung in the air over Elm Street that morning, the question that 9 minutes of video would cause thousands of people to lose sleep over, was this: if she stayed silent, was it because she had nothing to say, or because she knew this wasn't the moment yet? You'll understand exactly what that difference means by the time this story is over. Kyle Mercer had been on the job for 3 months. 3 months, and he already walked like he owned every sidewalk in Clearwater, Georgia, chin up, jaw set. One thumb hooked in his belt like he'd seen in the movies, like the posture alone could manufacture the authority he hadn't earned yet. He was 26 years old. He had never lived alone, never paid rent on time, never held a job longer than a year before the badge. His apartment still had a futon instead of a couch. His refrigerator held a six-pack, leftover pizza, and a half-empty bottle of hot sauce. He didn't cook. He didn't read. He didn't ask questions about things that made him uncomfortable. What he had was his father, Deputy Chief Frank Mercer, 22 years with the Clearwater PD, a man whose name opened doors in this town the way a master key opens locks, quietly, completely, without explanation. Frank Mercer had the kind of reputation built not on excellence, but on longevity, on knowing which stories to bury and which favors to call in, on being present at the right retirements, the right promotions, the right closed-door conversations where careers got decided before the paperwork was ever filed. When Kyle graduated the academy, barely, with 2 conduct flags and a psychological evaluation that had raised serious concerns about his temperament under pressure, Frank made phone calls. The flags disappeared. The evaluation was quietly reclassified. The badge arrived on a Tuesday morning while Frank watched from the front row, arms crossed, chest out, wearing the expression of a man who had arranged everything and was now waiting to be thanked for it. Kyle wore the badge like it was a birthright, because as far as he understood the world, it was. He'd grown up watching his father move through Clearwater with that easy authority. The nod from the mayor, the wave tab at Heller's Diner, the way people stepped back slightly when Frank walked into a room. Kyle had absorbed all of it, the posture, the tone, the assumption that rules existed for other people and that the uniform was a shield against consequence. He had never been seriously challenged. Not in school, not in training, not in 3 months on patrol. So when he spotted the dark blue Honda Accord sitting at the meter on Elm Street that Sunday morning, and something small and restless stirred in his chest, the itch that comes not from duty but from the need to feel powerful, he didn't question it. He crossed the street. Diane Carter had a rule she'd kept for 30 years. Never use what you have to win something you should be able to win without it. It wasn't a motto she'd written down anywhere. It wasn't something she said at conferences or quoted in interviews. It lived quietly in the back of her mind the way a compass lives in a drawer. You don't carry it everywhere, but you always know where it is, and when you need it, you trust it completely. She had grown up in a small town 40 miles east of Clearwater, the daughter of a high school janitor and a woman who cleaned other people's houses 6 days a week. Her parents had taught her 2 things with absolute consistency: show up on time, and don't let anyone make you feel small for knowing your rights. Those 2 lessons, repeated across 1,000 ordinary mornings, had carried her further than any single opportunity ever had. She put herself through college working night shifts at a hospital records desk. She got through law school on scholarships and black coffee and the quiet, grinding refusal to quit. She clerked for a federal judge at 28, made partner at a litigation firm at 34, and accepted her appointment to the federal district court bench at 42. Not because the path had been easy, but because she had never once confused difficulty with impossibility. 30 years on, she still drove herself to the farmer's market on Sunday mornings. No driver, no security detail, no announcement. She bought her own peaches, she carried her own bag. She fed the meter herself and kept the receipt on the dashboard the way the signage instructed, because following the rules was not something she did to perform compliance. It was something she did because she believed, in the most practical and unsentimental way possible, that systems only work when people inside them behave as though the systems matter. That belief had cost her things over the years. There had been moments, a handful, spread across 3 decades, when invoking her position would have made a problem disappear instantly. She had never done it, not once. Not because she was above using authority, but because she understood, at a level most people never examine in themselves, that authority used carelessly becomes the very thing it was designed to prevent. Somewhere in the years between her clerkship and the bench, she had arrived at a conclusion she never said aloud to anyone. The law doesn't protect people because it's powerful. It protects people because enough of them still believe it applies equally to everyone. The moment you use it differently for yourself, you've already broken the thing you were trying to protect. She thought about that sometimes in the quiet of her car before walking into court, not as inspiration, just as a reminder of what she was actually doing there. She was still thinking about it when she turned off the engine on Elm Street and reached for her canvas bag. 22 days. That was the number sitting at the back of Diane's mind like a quiet clock, not urgent yet, but running. In 22 days, the independent review board she chaired would convene for its quarterly vote on probationary officers across 3 departments, including Clearwater PD. 14 names on the list. Evaluations already submitted. Her signature required to finalize each decision. It was the kind of work that didn't make headlines. No cameras, no speeches. Just a closed room, a stack of files, and the obligation to be honest about who should carry a badge and who shouldn't. She took it more seriously than almost anything else on her docket, because the officers who cleared that board didn't just get to keep their jobs, they got to keep their power over other people's lives. She hadn't looked at the names yet. She made a point of not reviewing the list until the week of the hearing, so nothing she encountered in her daily life could unconsciously color her judgment. It was a discipline she'd maintained for 6 years running. This Sunday was supposed to be completely ordinary. She had a full week ahead. 2 federal hearings Monday and Tuesday, a sentencing Wednesday morning, and a conference call Thursday with the Justice Department that had been rescheduled 3 times already. She had allowed herself exactly 90 minutes at the farmer's market. Peaches, fresh herbs, maybe the sourdough from the baker at the far end if the line wasn't too long. Then home. Then the stack of briefs on her kitchen table that weren't going to read themselves. Her phone was on silent. It was one of the few rules she enforced for herself without exception. Sunday mornings before noon, the phone stayed in her bag. The world had her 5.5 other days. It could wait. She fed the meter at 10:17 a.m. 4 quarters for 2 hours, far more than she needed. But she'd learned long ago that the small disciplines were worth maintaining precisely because they were small. She placed the receipt on the dashboard, visible through the windshield, exactly where the posted signage instructed. Then she slung her canvas bag over her shoulder and walked toward the market. She didn't notice the patrol car idling at the far end of the block. She wasn't looking for trouble. She had no reason to be. In 22 days, she would determine whether 14 officers deserved to keep their badges. She had no way of knowing that one of them was already watching her walk away. Kyle didn't approach the car right away. He stood at the corner of Elm and 3rd for a moment, weight shifted to one hip, watching. It was a habit he'd picked up not from training but from his father. That particular stillness that looks like patience but is actually calculation. Waiting to see if the owner comes back quickly. Waiting to see if there's an easy exit. Waiting mostly to see if anyone is watching him watch. Nobody was. The farmer's market crowd moved in the other direction, downstream toward the produce stalls and the bread vendors and the woman who sold honey out of a wooden cart she'd been pushing to this corner since before Kyle was born. He crossed the street. The Honda Accord was clean and unremarkable, dark blue, a few years old, nothing that announced anything about the person who drove it. He circled it once with the slow, deliberate movement of someone performing authority for an invisible audience. His eyes moved across the exterior the way he'd been taught in training, registration sticker, tire condition, any visible contraband through the windows. That's when he should have stopped, because through the windshield, sitting flat on the dashboard directly in front of the steering wheel, was a parking receipt. White paper, printed timestamp, the Clearwater Municipal logo in the upper left corner, placed exactly where the posted meter signage instructed drivers to display it. Visible from 6 feet away in clear morning light, he saw it. That much became clear later, when the timeline was reconstructed from the footage. His eyes moved across the dashboard. They paused, just briefly, just a fraction of a second, on the receipt. Then they moved on. He took out his citation book anyway. He wrote the time, 10:20 a.m., and then stopped, pen hovering. There was no valid violation here. The meter was paid, the receipt was displayed, the vehicle was in a legal zone during legal hours. He knew the parking ordinances for this district. He'd been assigned to it for 11 weeks, so he invented one, Code 1177, Saturday Commercial Vehicle Restriction. He wrote it down in his clean, unhurried handwriting. The same handwriting his academy instructors had once noted was unusually careful for someone who rushed through everything else, and he felt the small, tight satisfaction of a man who has decided the outcome and is now building the paperwork to support it. He didn't ask himself why. That was the thing that would matter later, when people tried to understand what had happened on Elm Street. Not whether he knew the ordinance was fake, he did, but whether he'd paused even once to ask himself what he was actually doing and why. He hadn't. He was still writing when he heard footsteps on the sidewalk behind him, unhurried, steady, the particular rhythm of someone who has been walking this route for years and has no reason to change their pace. He turned. The woman coming toward him had a canvas bag over one shoulder, a light blazer over a simple blouse, and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She was looking at him the way someone looks at a thing that is slightly out of place, not alarmed, not hostile, just noticing. She stopped 3 feet away. "Good morning, officer. Is there a problem? License registration. You're parked in a restricted zone." Diane set her canvas bag down on the hood of her car. Not quickly, not slowly. Just the natural motion of someone making room to deal with something that requires both hands. "What restriction, specifically?" she asked. "This is a standard metered zone on a Sunday morning. I paid the meter at 10:17. The receipt is on the dashboard. Code 1177, Saturday Commercial Vehicle Restriction." She looked at him for a moment without speaking. Not the look of someone searching for an argument. The look of someone running a very quick internal check against a very large internal database. "That ordinance doesn't exist," she said. "You'll have the opportunity to contest it in court." He kept writing. "License and registration, ma'am." Here is where most people would have made one of two mistakes. They would have either backed down, produced the documents, taken the ticket, absorbed the injustice quietly to avoid escalation, or they would have raised their voice, which would have handed him exactly the narrative he needed. The difficult woman, the uncooperative subject, the situation that required firm handling. Diane didn't either. "I'd like your badge number," she said, "and your supervising officer's name." Something moved across his face then. Not quite anger, not quite surprise. Something colder and more deliberate. The expression of a person who has decided that the request itself is the problem, not the behavior that prompted it. "You'll get it on your court date." He closed his citation book. Turn around, hands on the vehicle. 30 feet away, a woman named Ruth Hadley stopped walking. Ruth was 63, retired, a former 6th grade teacher who came to this market every Sunday for the tomatoes and stayed for the coffee from the vendor near the east entrance. She had her phone in her hand because she'd been about to call her daughter. She didn't make that call. Instead, without fully deciding to, she raised the phone and pressed record. She would later tell investigators she didn't know why she did it immediately, only that something about the scene felt wrong in a way she recognized from years of watching children being treated unfairly. That specific quality of injustice that announces itself not through noise, but through an unsettling, persistent quiet. Diane had not moved. Her hands were visible at her sides. Her voice had not changed in pitch or speed. "I have not violated any law," she said. "I will not comply with an unlawful order." And here is the question that 9 minutes of footage would force thousands of people to sit with long after the video ended. When someone follows every rule, stays perfectly calm, asks for nothing more than basic procedural accountability, and is handcuffed anyway, what exactly is the law protecting in that moment? The handcuffs came out. Diane Carter did not step back. She did not look away. She stood exactly where she was and let the record show everything. Marcus Webb saw it happen from the beginning. He was sitting on the low concrete wall outside the hardware store across the street. drinking coffee from a paper cup, waiting for his business partner to show up so they could load a truck with supplies for a job Monday morning. He had nothing to do but wait, so he watched. He watched Kyle cross the street and circle the car. He watched the citation book come out. He watched Diane return with her bag of peaches, calm and unhurried, and ask her question. He watched Kyle's jaw tighten when she asked for the badge number. He watched the handcuffs come out. And then Marcus Webb, 41 years old, former Army corporal, currently licensed contractor, looked down at his coffee cup and did not move. He told himself it wasn't his business. He told himself she'd be fine. It would get sorted out at the station. These things always did. There were processes for this. The system had ways of correcting itself. He told himself that getting involved would only make it worse. That a black man stepping off a wall and walking toward a police interaction on a Sunday morning was not a small calculation, and he knew it. And his body knew it before his mind finished the sentence. So he stayed where he was, but his hands wouldn't quite hold the coffee cup steady. And something he hadn't felt in years, something that lived in the chest and had no clean name, somewhere between shame and fury and the exhausted recognition of a pattern, settled into him and didn't leave. He was watching a woman do everything right, everything. Calm voice, visible hands, specific, legitimate questions, no aggression, no evasion, no pretext for any of this. And it was making no difference at all. Around him, others were stopping too. A man with a stroller, 2 teenagers with market bags, an older couple who had come for the flowers. They formed the loose, uncertain geometry of people who want to help and don't know how, or have already learned what happens when they try. Nobody spoke. Ruth Hadley kept filming from 30 feet away, her hand steadier than anyone watching her would have expected. And Marcus Webb stared at his coffee cup and thought about the specific weight of choosing not to act, and whether, years from now, he'd be able to explain it to himself in a way that still felt honest. Ruth Hadley sent the video to 3 people before Kyle Mercer finished walking Diane Carter through the precinct doors. She didn't post it publicly. Not yet. She sent it to her daughter, who was a paralegal. She sent it to a neighbor who worked at the local news affiliate. And she sent it to a man named Gerald Okafor, who ran a community accountability organization out of a converted storefront on 5th Street and had been documenting interactions like this one for 11 years. She typed the same message to all 3. Elm Street, this morning. Please watch the whole thing. Then she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, phone in both hands, and thought about whether she'd done the right thing or simply the easy thing. There was a difference, she'd always believed. The easy thing required no courage. The right thing sometimes cost you something. She decided it was both, and that being both didn't make it less necessary. Across the street, Marcus Webb finally stood up from the concrete wall. His business partner still hadn't arrived. He walked to the corner, stopped, looked in the direction of the precinct 2 blocks north, and made a decision that surprised him slightly. He pulled out his own phone. He called the non-emergency line for Clearwater PD. He waited through 4 rings and a hold message and another 3 rings before someone picked up. I want to report what I believe was an unlawful detention, he said. Elm Street, approximately 10:22 this morning. I'm a witness. I have contact information. The officer who answered took his name and number in a tone that suggested the information was going directly into a pile where it would wait to be ignored. Marcus thanked him anyway, hung up, stood on the corner for another moment. He hadn't stepped off the wall when it might have mattered. He knew that. It sat in him the way these things sit, not screaming, just present, the way a splinter is present even when you're not pressing on it. But he had done something. And the something he had done was now logged, time-stamped, attached to his name, in a situation built entirely on a fiction, a fabricated ordinance, a pretended authority, a story one man had decided to tell. A time-stamped record with a real name attached to it was not nothing. It was a thread. And threads, pulled carefully, unravel things. The Clearwater Police Department's front desk at 10:47 on a Sunday morning was usually quiet. Sergeant Lou Briggs liked it that way. He was 54 years old, 18 years on the job, and he had developed over time the particular talent of experienced desk sergeants everywhere, the ability to process incoming situations with his face completely neutral while his brain ran a separate, faster calculation underneath. He was updating an incident log when the door opened. He looked up. Kyle Mercer walked in with the posture of a man delivering something he expected to be praised for. Chin up, one hand on his citation book, the other lightly on Diane Carter's arm as he guided her toward the booking desk. His expression had that specific quality Kyle's expression often had, the performance of competence rather than the thing itself. Briggs looked at the woman beside him. She was composed in a way that gave him pause. Not resigned, not frightened, not the contained agitation of someone running through their options. Just still, watching. The kind of stillness that in Briggs's experience belonged to one of two types of people. Those who had completely given up, and those who were waiting for exactly the right moment. She did not look like someone who had given up. Unlawful parking, resisting a lawful order, Kyle said, dropping the citation on the desk with the flat confidence of a man who considers paperwork a formality. Code 1177, Saturday commercial restriction. She got combative when I asked for ID. Briggs picked up the citation. Read it, set it down. Code 1177, he repeated. Yes, sir. Briggs looked at the citation again, then at Kyle, then, briefly, at the woman standing beside him with red lines already forming on her wrists where the cuffs had been too tight. He reached for his pen. He asked for her name. She told him. He wrote the first 4 letters, D-I-A-N, and then his pen stopped, not slowed, stopped. The room was the same temperature it had been 30 seconds ago. The ceiling fan made the same sound. The radio on the back desk played the same Sunday morning programming it always did. But something had shifted in the air above the booking desk in a way that Kyle Mercer, standing 2 feet away, was only just beginning to feel. The way you feel a change in pressure before you understand what it means. Dawson. Briggs said it quietly. The way someone says a word when they need a second to make sure they're reading it correctly. He looked up from the paper. He looked at the woman standing across the desk from him. He looked back down at the 4 letters. Then he said the full name. Diane Carter. It wasn't a question. It was the specific tone of a man confirming something he already knew the weight of before the sentence finished leaving his mouth. Kyle shifted his weight. Yeah. She gave me some attitude about the ordinance, started demanding badge numbers, wouldn't comply when Do you know who this is? The question came out flat. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just flat, the way a door sounds when it closes on something final. Kyle shrugged. The shrug of a man who has decided that the identity of the person he handcuffed is a secondary detail. Lady with an attitude and a parking problem. Briggs set his pen down on the desk. He did it carefully, the way you set something down when you need both hands free and your full attention on what comes next. This is Judge Diane Carter, he said. Federal District Court. 12 years on the bench. He paused, not for effect, but because he was watching Kyle's face very carefully. She personally signed the consent decree your entire department operates under. The smirk on Kyle's face held. 2 seconds, maybe 3. She also chairs the Independent Review Board, Briggs continued. That votes on your probationary status in 22 days. The smirk died. It didn't fade. It didn't shift into something else gradually. It simply stopped existing, the way a light stops when the power cuts. There, and then not there, with nothing in between. Kyle turned and looked at Diane Carter. Really looked at her. The way you look at something after you realize you've been holding it upside down the entire time, and every assumption you made from the beginning was built on that single foundational error. His mouth opened, nothing came out. Diane looked back at him. She didn't smile. She didn't cross her arms. She just stood there, hands visible, reading glasses still on their chain, the canvas bag of peaches sitting on the floor beside her left foot, where she'd set it down when the cuffs went on. The silence in that precinct was the loudest thing anyone in that room had ever heard. She didn't say she was a judge. Kyle's voice cracked on the last word. Just slightly, just enough. Briggs looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he picked up the desk phone and made 2 calls. The first was Captain Sandra Reeves, who was the Sunday duty commander, and whose home number Briggs had memorized years ago for exactly the kind of situation that was never supposed to happen, but periodically did. The second call was to the department's legal liaison, a careful, precise man named Arthur Finch, who had a gift for arriving quickly when the words federal judge and wrongful detention appeared in the same sentence. Both calls were short. Both produced results within 8 minutes. Captain Reeves arrived first. She was 50 years old, 23 years on the force, and she walked through the door with the expression of someone who has been woken from a Sunday morning she will not get back, and has already done the math on exactly how serious this is. She looked at Kyle. She looked at Diane. She looked at Briggs, who gave her a single slow nod that communicated everything the phone call hadn't covered. She introduced herself to Diane with the careful courtesy of someone performing damage control while simultaneously trying to accurately assess the full dimensions of the damage. "Judge Carter, I am deeply sorry for what has occurred this morning. We are going to make this right." Diane acknowledged her with a nod. She was seated now, at Briggs's quiet insistence, in the chair beside the desk rather than standing at the counter. She had not asked for anything. She had not made any threats. She had simply answered questions when asked and remained, throughout, in full possession of herself in a way that filled the room more completely than any raised voice could have. Arthur Finch arrived 6 minutes later with a laptop bag and the contained urgency of a man who has run through the legal exposure in his head during the drive over and arrived at a number that concerns him. He conferred with Captain Reeves in low tones near the door for approximately 90 seconds. Then he approached the desk. Kyle was still standing near the booking counter. No one had told him to leave. No one had told him to stay. He existed in the room now the way a mistake exists after it has been identified. Present, undeniable, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. He had taken his hat off at some point. He was holding it in both hands. He was thinking, for the first time with genuine urgency, about the 2 conduct flags that had disappeared from his file, about the psychological evaluation his father had quietly reclassified, about the phone calls made and favors spent to put this badge on his chest on a Tuesday morning while his father watched from the front row with his arms crossed. He was thinking about all the protection that had been built around him, layer by careful layer, over years. And he was thinking with a cold and clarifying fear about whether any of it was going to hold. He already knew the answer. He just wasn't ready to say it yet. 3 other officers had been in the precinct when Kyle walked Diane through the door. Officer Dennis Polk, 7 years on the job, had been finishing a report at the corner desk. Officer Yolanda Sims, 4 years, had been refilling her coffee near the back wall. And a rookie named Tanner Briggs. No relation to the sergeant, a coincidence that had been noted and joked about exactly once during his first week, had been standing near the supply room door, technically on break, technically not required to be paying attention to anything. All 3 had heard everything. None of them had said a word. Polk had gone very still over his keyboard when Briggs read the name. He had not looked up. He was 41 years old and had worked under Frank Mercer's extended influence for most of his career, and he understood, with the immediate physical certainty of someone who has spent years reading institutional weather, exactly what kind of storm had just walked through the front door. Sims had set her coffee down quietly and found something on her phone to look at. She had her own reasons for keeping her head down. A commendation review pending, a transfer request filed 2 months ago that hadn't moved, a supervisor whose approval she needed and whose connection to Frank Mercer she was acutely aware of. Tanner, the rookie, had simply watched. He was 23 years old and had been on the job for 6 weeks and had not yet fully learned the particular institutional skill of looking at something clearly wrong and finding a reason to look away. He would learn it, probably. Most people did. But he hadn't learned it yet, which meant he was the only person in the room whose face showed exactly what he was thinking. He was thinking this was wrong. He was thinking it had been wrong from the moment Kyle walked in. He was thinking about the red marks on the woman's wrists, and the way Sergeant Briggs's pen had stopped, and the specific silence that had followed. The silence of people who know something, and are each separately calculating the cost of saying it out loud. He didn't speak either. He told himself it was because he was too new, too junior, not his place. Later, when investigators asked each of them separately what they had witnessed that Sunday morning, all 3 would tell the truth. But in the moment, in the room, while it was still happening, they had all made the same quiet calculation, and the woman with the red marks on her wrists had watched them make it, one by one, without saying a single word. At 11:14 a.m., Gerald Okafor watched Ruth Hadley's video for the 3rd time. He watched it the way he watched all of them. Not for the emotion which he had learned over 11 years to set aside during the first viewing, but for the details. The timestamp on the meter receipt visible through the windshield. The exact wording Kyle used when he cited code 1177. The specific moment when Diane asked for the badge number and something shifted in Kyle's face. The 9 minutes and 40 seconds between first contact and the precinct door. Then he picked up his phone and called the one person he called whenever something moved from documentation territory into legal territory. Her name was Patricia Voss. She was a civil rights attorney based in Atlanta, 47 years old, with a record of civil accountability cases that had quietly reshaped use of force policy in 4 Georgia counties over the past decade. She answered on the second ring, which meant she was already awake and already working, which was the only version of Patricia Voss that Gerald had ever encountered. He sent her the video while they talked. He heard the precise moment she watched the citation being written, a short silence, then a single word he wouldn't repeat, and then she was already moving. "Who is she?" Patricia asked. Gerald told her. Another silence, longer this time. "Gerald," she said finally, in the tone of someone recalibrating the entire scope of a situation in real time. "Do you understand what this man just did? He did. That was the thing about documentation work. You developed, over years, a very clear sense of the spectrum. Most of what Gerald recorded existed in the vast, exhausting middle. Wrong, demonstrable, unlikely to produce consequences proportional to the harm. What had happened on Elm Street this morning was different. Not because the victim was a federal judge. The wrongness of it would have been identical if she'd been anyone else. But because the specific combination of who she was, what he had fabricated, and what was on camera had produced something rare. A situation with no exits. Gerald spent the next 40 minutes making calls. He reached a contact at the local news affiliate who had already received Ruth's video from a second source and was pulling Sunday staff in. He reached a court reporter who covered the federal district and went very quiet when Gerald told him the name. He sent the time-stamped footage to Patricia's secure server, along with Marcus Webb's logged witness report, which Gerald had obtained through a contact at the non-emergency dispatch center. By 11:52 a.m., the video had been viewed by the duty editor at a regional news desk. By 12:08 p.m., it had been forwarded to a producer at a national affiliate. Kyle Mercer was still standing near the booking counter, holding his hat, watching Captain Reeves and Arthur Finch confer near the door. He had no idea that outside the precinct walls, the clock had already run out. Arthur Finch opened his laptop on the corner of Briggs's desk and pulled up the municipal code database for Clearwater, Georgia. It took him 11 seconds to confirm what Diane had known standing on Elm Street 40 minutes earlier. Code 1177 did not exist, had never existed. The municipal code jumped from 1174, restricted loading zones near school crossings, to 1178, overnight commercial vehicle ordinance, with nothing in between. The gap wasn't an oversight or an expired statute. It was simply empty space. The kind of empty space that only becomes significant when someone decides to fill it with something they invented. He turned the laptop so Captain Reeves could see the screen. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she looked at Kyle. Kyle was staring at the floor. Finch pulled up a second database, the department's internal citation records, searchable by ordinance number. He typed in 1177. The search returned 4 results. All 4 had been issued within the past 11 weeks. All 4 bore the same officer number. All 4 were Kyle Mercer's. Reeves put one hand flat on the desk. It was a small gesture, barely noticeable. But Briggs noticed it because he had worked with her for 9 years, and he knew that particular gesture meant she was absorbing something that was worse than she had initially calculated. 4 citations, 4 fabricated violations, 4 people who had presumably paid fines or contested them, or simply absorbed the cost and the inconvenience and moved on, because that is what most people do when the system tells them they owe something, even when they don't. Because fighting it costs more than paying it, and most people cannot afford the fight. Finch printed the search results. He stapled them once, cleanly, and set them beside the original citation on the desk. Then he said, in the careful tone of a man who chooses his words the way a surgeon chooses instruments, "Captain, I need to flag something." He turned to a third tab, Internal Affairs Complaint Logs. Searchable by officer name and filing date, he typed in Kyle Mercer. 2 prior complaints, both filed within the past 8 weeks, both logged as received, both marked in the status column with a single word that should have triggered a supervisory review and hadn't. Pending. Reeves looked at the screen, then at Finch, then at the complaint logs, specifically at the field that listed the reviewing supervisor for each pending file. The name in that field on both complaints was the same. Deputy Chief Frank Mercer. Nobody said it aloud. Nobody needed to. The name sat on the screen in plain department font, and everyone in the room who was looking at it understood simultaneously that what had begun as a wrongful detention on a Sunday morning had just become something with a much longer history and a much wider circumference. The thread Marcus Webb had pulled from the corner of Elm and 3rd was connected to something larger than anyone in that room had fully seen yet. At 12:31 p.m., Captain Reeves made the call to Deputy Chief Frank Mercer. She made it from the hallway outside the booking area, door closed, voice low. Briggs couldn't hear the words. He could hear the tone, the flat, careful cadence of someone delivering information rather than asking for guidance. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. When Reeves came back through the door, her expression had not changed, but something behind it had. She walked directly to Kyle. Badge and weapon. Now Kyle's head came up. "Captain, I can explain the badge and weapon." He unholstered slowly. Set both on the desk, with the careful movements of someone performing compliance, while their mind runs ahead to every possible version of what happens next. His hand stayed on the badge for 1 extra second before Reeves picked it up. He had worn it for 3 months. It had felt every single day like something permanent. Across the room, Diane Carter sat quietly and watched. She had been offered water twice and accepted once. She had been offered the use of a private office to make calls and had declined. She had asked, once, whether she was being formally charged with anything, and when Reeves said no, she had nodded and said nothing further. She had her phone out now, not making calls, just holding it, her thumb moving slowly across the screen in the manner of someone reading rather than scrolling. She was reading the municipal code, not because she needed to. She had known the municipal code since before Kyle Mercer was old enough to ride a bicycle. She was reading it the way you return to a known text after something has tried to make you doubt yourself. Not for information, but for the specific steadiness that comes from standing on ground you know is solid. Her wrists still hurt. The red lines from the cuffs had deepened to something that would bruise by evening. Every time she shifted in the chair, she was aware of them, not dramatically, not in a way that showed on her face, but present. The way certain things are present that you cannot will away simply by deciding not to acknowledge them. She thought about the 4 other citations Finch had pulled up on that screen. 4 other people. 4 other Sunday mornings, or Tuesday afternoons, or Thursday commutes. 4 other moments when someone had been handed a piece of paper describing a violation that didn't exist and had been left to absorb it alone, without the municipal code memorized, without 30 years of legal practice, without the specific knowledge that what was being done to them had a name and a remedy. Most of them had probably paid the fine. That thought sat heavier than anything that had happened to her personally that morning. Heavier than the cuffs. Heavier than the walk through the precinct door. Heavier than the look on Kyle Mercer's face when Briggs said her name. That particular look of a person realizing, too late, the full dimensions of what they've done. She set her phone down on her knee. Outside, through the precinct's single street-facing window, she could see the first news van pulling up to the curb. The false defeat had lasted exactly 1 hour and 44 minutes. What came next would last considerably longer. Diane's daughter called at 12:44 p.m. Her name was Simone. She was 31 years old, a pediatric resident at a hospital in Atlanta, and she had received Ruth Hadley's video from a law school friend who had received it from someone else in the particular chain of hands way that things travel when they are too wrong to sit still. She had watched it twice in a supply closet between rounds and then called her mother's phone with the specific controlled urgency of someone who has been trained to stay calm in emergencies and is finding that training genuinely difficult to access right now. Diane answered on the second ring. "Mom, I saw the video. Are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm at the precinct on Holloway Street." "I'm fine, Simone. You're still there?" "Are you?" "Did they, Mom? Your wrists." "I'm fine." A pause. "Quieter, I promise." Simone was silent for a moment. Diane could hear the ambient sounds of the hospital behind her, the soft percussion of a busy floor, the distant announce of an intercom, the particular quality of air that belongs to places where people spend their days trying to prevent irreversible things. "I'm coming," Simone said. "You're working. I'm coming after my shift. I'll be there by 7. Diane didn't argue. She had learned, across 31 years of raising a daughter who had inherited her mother's particular brand of quiet determination, that there were moments when the argument wasn't worth having because the outcome was already decided. "All right," she said. "I'll be home by then. Bring yourself. Don't bring anything else." "Mom," Simone, another pause. Longer. "Did you know?" Simone asked. "When it was happening, did you know it would end up okay?" Diane considered the question honestly. She looked at the red lines on her wrists. She thought about the 4 people who had received fabricated citations before her and hadn't known what they were looking at. She thought about Ruth Hadley raising a phone on a Sunday morning because something felt wrong in a way she recognized. She thought about Marcus Webb sitting on a concrete wall with unsteady hands, making a call nobody expected him to make. "No," she said. "I knew what the law said. That's not the same thing." Simone was quiet for a moment, then, I love you too. "Go finish your shift." She hung up, sat with the phone in her lap, looked at the window where the news van was still parked at the curb. Then she stood up, straightened her blazer, and walked toward Captain Reeves. It was time. At 1:07 p.m., Captain Reeves opened the precinct's front door and walked outside. The news van from the local affiliate had been joined by a second vehicle, a regional crew that had driven in from Macon after the video crossed their desk at 12:08. There were 11 people on the sidewalk outside the Clearwater PD on Holloway Street. 3 reporters, 2 camera operators, Gerald Okafor with his documentation kit, 2 community members who had been at the farmers market that morning and followed the situation here, and Marcus Webb, who had driven over after his business partner finally arrived, and they agreed without much discussion that the lumber could wait. Patricia Voss was on the phone with Gerald when Reeves came out. She was still in Atlanta, but she had already filed a formal notice of civil rights violation with the Federal District Court Clerk's office, time-stamped 12:51 p.m., and had a second filing prepared and waiting. She had also, in the 40 minutes since Gerald first called her, pulled Kyle Mercer's publicly available Academy records, cross-referenced the 4 fabricated Code 1177 citations against the Municipal Fine Payment Database, and confirmed that 3 of the 4 recipients had paid without contest. The total collected on fictional violations, $460, absorbed quietly by 4 people who had no reason to believe the system was lying to them. She had the documentation in a folder on her laptop. She had sent a copy to Gerald's secure server. She had sent a second copy to the federal court clerk's office as an exhibit attachment to her filing. When Reeves stepped outside and the cameras turned on, Diane Carter walked out behind her. She had straightened her blazer. Her reading glasses were still on their chain. She carried nothing except her phone and her canvas bag, the same bag she had brought to the farmer's market that morning, the peaches still inside, slightly warm now from the hours indoors. She stood beside Captain Reeves and waited. Reeves spoke first. Her statement was precise and unembellished. Officer Kyle Mercer had been relieved of his badge and service weapon, pending formal investigation into the unlawful detention of a civilian, the fabrication of a municipal ordinance, and conduct unbecoming. The department's Internal Affairs Division had been formally notified. An independent review had been requested from the state attorney's office. All department operations falling under the consent decree signed by Judge Diane Carter would continue without interruption under the oversight of the federal district court. She did not editorialize. She did not apologize on behalf of the department in the vague, institutional way that sounds like accountability and means nothing. She stated facts. She named consequences. She stopped when the facts ran out. Then she stepped back. Diane stepped forward. She produced her federal judicial identification from the inside pocket of her blazer, a laminated card bearing her photograph, her full name, her appointment date, and the seal of the United States District Court. She held it briefly toward the cameras, not for drama, but for the record, the way she held up exhibits in court. "Here is what this is. Here is what it means. Now let the record reflect it." Then she spoke. "This morning I was detained, handcuffed, and brought to this precinct on the basis of a parking ordinance that does not exist in the Clearwater Municipal Code. I paid the meter. I displayed the receipt. I asked for the officer's badge number and was denied. I stated clearly that I would not comply with an unlawful order. None of that changed what happened." She paused. "Not for effect, because what came next required precision. I want to be very clear about something. What happened to me this morning was wrong, not because of who I am. It was wrong because it was wrong. The 4 people who received citations under the same fabricated ordinance before me had the same rights I had on that sidewalk. They were owed the same accountability. The fact that most of them paid and moved on is not evidence that the system worked. It is evidence of exactly how the system was being used." Gerald Okafor, standing at the back of the small crowd, wrote something in his notebook. Marcus Webb stood with his arms at his sides and his jaw tight, listening to a woman say plainly what he had been turning over in his own mind since he sat on that concrete wall with unsteady hands 4 hours ago. The cameras recorded everything. Arthur Finch stepped forward then and confirmed on the record the findings from the internal citation database. 4 fabricated violations, same ordinance number, same officer, 11 weeks. He confirmed the 2 prior complaints marked pending under Deputy Chief Frank Mercer's review. He confirmed that as of 02 p.m., Frank Mercer had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation into a pattern of complaint suppression running through his office. 17 years, Finch said quietly. That was how far back the earliest buried complaint went. Diane did not look at the cameras when he said it. She looked at the precinct door. Behind it, somewhere, Kyle Mercer was still in the building, badgeless, weaponless, holding his hat in both hands, standing in the wreckage of every assumption his father had built for him, and he had never once thought to question. Then a reporter called out, "Judge Carter, what would you say to Officer Mercer right now?" She was quiet for a moment, long enough that the cameras leaned in. Then she said it. Quiet, final. The way verdicts are delivered. Not with heat, but with the specific gravity of something that has been carefully weighed and will not be reconsidered. I already said everything that needed to be said on Elm Street. He just wasn't listening yet. Kyle Mercer lost his badge that afternoon. Formally, permanently, with paperwork that could not be buried. Federal charges followed 4 weeks later. Civil rights violations, abuse of authority, falsification of official records. The 3 recipients of fabricated citations who had paid without contest were contacted individually by the city attorney's office, offered full refunds, and provided written confirmation that the violations had never been legally valid. The 4th recipient, a retired postal worker named Carl Deming, who had contested the citation and lost 3 hours of his life in a courthouse waiting room, before the case was quietly dropped, received an additional letter of formal apology from the department. He framed it. He said later that he wasn't sure if that meant he'd won something or just needed to remember that it had happened. Deputy Chief Frank Mercer was indicted 8 weeks after administrative leave began. The investigation that started with 2 pending complaints in an internal database expanded, as these things do when someone finally starts pulling, into 17 years of buried reports, manipulated evaluations, and institutional cover that had protected not just his son, but a pattern of conduct across multiple officers whose files had passed through his office. 4 additional officers were flagged. 2 were terminated. The consent decree that Diane had signed 6 years earlier was amended and strengthened, with new independent oversight provisions that Frank Mercer had spent years quietly lobbying against. At Kyle's sentencing, the judge read the verdict without drama. No speeches, just consequences, clear and proportional, the kind Kyle had never believed applied to him. As the bailiff let him out, same click of handcuffs, same steel, same wrists. A reporter called from the gallery, "Officer Mercer, anything to say?" He said nothing. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Ruth Hadley went back to the farmer's market the following Sunday. She bought her tomatoes and her coffee and stood for a moment near the meter on Elm Street, looking at the spot where she had raised her phone 8 days earlier and thought about the specific weight of a small decision made in an ordinary moment. She didn't consider herself brave. She had simply recognized something wrong and reached for the nearest tool she had. That, she decided, was probably what most of it came down to. 6 months after that Sunday morning, a small plaque appeared near the parking meter on Elm Street. Bronze letters, clean and simple, mounted on a low stone post the city had approved after a petition signed by 412 Clearwater residents. 3 words, "Stand where you belong." No name, no explanation, no editorial, just an instruction. The kind that means something different depending on where you're standing when you read it. And whether you've been honest with yourself about how you got there. Diane Carter drove past it on a Sunday morning on her way to the farmer's market. She slowed, read it once, then kept driving. She had peaches to buy. What would you have done? Standing on that sidewalk watching? Tell us in the comments. And if this story made you think, share it with someone who needs to hear it.